everybody doing? Doing good? All right. All 15 of you. The 4 guys from my group don't count. So, you know, the QCT asked us to come and kind of present at this event, in part because we've recently created a relationship and a joint solution together. And I'll be talking a little bit about that solution as I get on into the deck. But, you know, I just wanted to, you know, thank QCT for the opportunity. And we'll, you know, we definitely look forward to, you know, bringing some of this stuff to market. All right. So Avanade is the largest systems integrator in the Microsoft ecosystem. So we're a joint venture between Microsoft and Accenture. Basically the Microsoft-focused arm of Accenture. Accenture being a global, the global consulting company. We have about 35,000 consultants worldwide. So we're not a small company, and our revenues are, you know, well into the billions as a portion of Accenture. The most unique thing that we have that really no other SI has is our relationship, not just with Accenture, which is our main parent, but also our relationship with Microsoft, which is the other parent. And that relationship affords us to do some very, very unique things. And so as a result, we make significant investments in the Microsoft platform specifically, right? Accenture as a whole makes investments in a lot of the other ecosystems and platforms. So, you know, VMware, Red Hat OpenStack, et cetera. And we don't, you know, we certainly don't have a bias against those platforms when they fit. However, we're considered to generally be the Microsoft arm of the business. We do take pride in not being, you know, fanboys about it, right? We're here to support what's best for the client. We really take that from our Accenture lineage, but we do try to look at it with a Microsoft lens, the same way that, say, you know, some of the other groups at Accenture would look at it through an OpenStack lens or through another lens. So it's a kind of a very unique position. We are Microsoft's Worldwide Azure Partner of the Year for 2017. So that's their sort of highest partnership award. And then in addition to that, we drive more Azure consumption than any other partner. In fact, we drive more Azure consumption than the next 4 partners combined. So we are the biggest fish from a systems integrator perspective in the Azure ecosystem. And there's a reason for that. And that reason is really some of what we're going to talk about today. So when we think about cloud, and if you go back 5 years, right, and Accenture has a stated policy of public first. So we drive, you know, we work with our clients to adopt public cloud first. However, we understand that there are workloads, there are scenarios, there are all sorts of situations where the public cloud may not be the best fit for a particular business scenario. And in those circumstances, we adopt some form of on-premise cloud or a hosted cloud. That gives the customer the flexibility to, for example, meet regulatory and compliance concerns, meet edge and disconnected scenarios, meet latency scenarios, or meet a combination of all of those things. We generally, you know, try to stay away from the sort of fear of public cloud, right? 3 years ago, fear of public cloud might have been an acceptable scenario. Today, I think everybody in this room would agree that, you know, the public cloud providers, for the most part, have built up a basis of trust that, you know, for the vast majority of corporate workloads, they're fine, right? Maybe there's a few things that you wouldn't want to put out there, but for the vast majority of workloads, they tend to work. When we think about hybrid, you know, people have been selling a hybrid cloud model for years, right? But all that really meant was I'm going to go deploy a bunch of hybrid components or a bunch of private cloud components in your data center with their own set of APIs. Then I'm going to go ahead and move some of your workloads into public with their own set of APIs. And maybe you had some real loose consistency. Some of the platforms, which, for example, the early platforms supported, some of the Amazon APIs, for example, but they didn't necessarily support them with a high level of fidelity. Which is why, for example, a CloudFormation template is actually different than a Heat template. They're both similar, like really similar. Like in some cases, you can use the same template, but they're not the same thing, right? And so that I think is certainly guilty, right? In the past life, did an awful lot of selling hybrid in that way. Both on top of the Microsoft and the VMware and the Red Hat platforms. But when we think about what we have available now, what we really think is, the world is sort of redefining hybrid. And you're seeing this with the VMware Amazon integration. So that's a kind of a case in point where you can take VMware workloads, you can run them on VMware on-prem, or you can take VMware workloads and run them in Amazon on VMware using the VMware APIs. That is, a consistent hybrid IaaS cloud. Absolutely. And if you run Pivotal on top of both of them, you could argue that you have some, you certainly have some PaaS services that are wrapped into that. When you think about what Microsoft's been doing, they went out it the other direction, right? They have a consistent set of APIs and a consistent portal experience, both in their Azure Stack product and in Azure Public. And you could trace that back to Windows Azure Pack, right, which was the predecessor. It was the old Azure portal. It wasn't a consistent API, but it had at least a consistent portal experience, and in general had some level of resource consistency. Azure Stack is a bit different. It was designed from the ground up to be consistent with Azure, and quite frankly, the rule is pretty straightforward. If it's not consistent with Azure, it does not go into Azure Stack in terms of API and portal experience. So there's not a case where those two will diverge, right? There's a case where Azure Stack is not as capable as Azure. It doesn't necessarily have all the services of Azure, but every service that's available on Azure Stack is available in Azure. So if you write an application for Azure Stack, you can deploy it to Azure Stack, or you can deploy it to Azure. And that really gets into the use case that Pat was talking about in his keynote this morning around write once, run anywhere. And this is something that we're hearing from clients is an important case. Again, this is a case where for regulatory reasons, for network connectivity, latency, other concerns, you're running private. We don't see Azure Stack today, certainly not, but even in the future, we don't see Azure Stack as a replacement for Azure Public. If you can fit Azure Public, into your use case, by all means, run as much stuff as you can in it. The innovation is going to always happen faster in the hyperscale cloud. They've just got way more to throw at that. And they'll bring that innovation down to the private cloud components, but they won't bring that innovation down to the private cloud components at the same pace, and they won't bring everything. There's plenty of stuff that can really only be done in a hyperscale cloud because of the scale that's needed for it. The next thing is we heard from customers repeatedly, particularly around OpenStack, I think early on in its evolution, one throat to choke, right? Customers are tired of stitching together a cloud themselves out of 25 different products and then having to manage it. So the idea that you're going to go buy hardware from one vendor, you're going to buy SAN from another vendor, you're going to buy networking from another vendor, you're going to try to take advantage of, for example, Cisco ACI, you're going to try to take advantage of, for example, some of the NetApp technology on the storage front, right? It's become increasingly hard, unless you happen to have an army of guys that know all of those technologies, to build an end-to-end solution. And so Microsoft with Azure Stack took a different approach. They sort of said, we're only going to sell this through certified platforms, which means that we've, in essence, partnered with people, selected a particular platform, certified that configuration, and that's the only way you buy it. It's a turnkey thing. So it arrives as a black box to the customer. It's set up. It just works. However, it left a bit of a gap. And when we look at what the analysts are saying, they're pretty bullish on hybrid cloud. But there's an important theme in here. If you look at the 451 research quote, customers would be willing to pay a 2x premium for a one throat to choke trusted advisor solution. Customers are gun shy about running this stuff. They're gun shy about buying it and having to be saddled with it after the fact. One of the things that the pivot to public cloud has really forced onto customers, or forced customers to adjust to, is, hey, I don't have to run my data center anymore. I don't have to run all of this stuff anymore. So now you're introducing a cloud platform, but you're telling them, well, Mr. Customer, you still have to manage the hardware that comes in the door, right? For a lot of customers, that's not really an option anymore. That guy that used to do the cloud management, yeah, he's moved on to doing billing reconciliation on the back end for cloud, or he's left the company, or he's done something else, right? And in many cases, a lot of these companies have plans to close their data centers, or to significantly shrink the footprint of those data centers over time. And so their goal is, whether from an interim perspective or whether from a long-term perspective, their goal is to cloudify as much stuff as they can. And to them, cloudify is not just portals and APIs, but it's also who's responsible for running the infrastructure, and to some extent where it runs. So if you look across Azure Stack, it's a consistent platform with Azure, as I've mentioned. So it's a consistent set of APIs. An ARM template that's designed for Azure Stack will run in Azure completely unmodified. The VM sizes are the same, the SKUs are the same, the capabilities are the same. The difference is that Azure moves at a faster rate than Azure Stack. And so there are features in Azure that are not available in Azure Stack today. The stated goal by Microsoft is to stay about 6 months behind Azure in terms of API compatibility. That is individual features on a particular resource, and to only introduce resource types that make sense in a sort of a private scenario into Azure Stack. So those are two key things. You're not going to see Azure Batch, for example, show up in Azure Stack. Azure Batch is the high performance compute component of Azure. Well, why not? Because quite frankly, Azure Stack today has scale limitations. You can go basically up to 12 nodes per stamp. Well, I don't think 12 nodes is going to be an ideal high performance compute cluster, right? Maybe once we get thousands of nodes, we'll possibly think about seeing an Azure Batch. But the other thing is, Azure Batch makes a ton of sense for companies because high performance compute clusters are generally time driven. So if you can spin up an Azure Batch cluster, run your job on it, and then spin it down with massive parallelism, you're going to save a ton of money versus setting aside and dedicating huge quantities of CPU resources on-prem. Now, there are some businesses where they can absolutely justify that, oil and gas, semiconductor tape out, stuff like that. But that's not, those are scenarios where, quite frankly, they want to run HPC on bare metal anyway. So sticking a cloud hypervisor in between doesn't make any sense because you've already invested, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in building out this capability. The last thing you want to do is take 5% of the headroom and, cloudify it. So the key thing with the consistent API is it means that we have a consistent tool set. So if I write an application in Visual Studio, if I write a Chef, a CI/CD script in Chef or Puppet or pretty much whatever, and it works against Azure, it will work against Azure Stack. So that means I don't have to reinvent my tooling for Azure Stack. Azure Stack manifests itself to your tools in the same way as the Azure National Clouds. So today, Azure has a couple of endpoints. There's the main Azure endpoint, there's an Azure Gov Cloud endpoint, and then there's Azure National Cloud endpoints. National Clouds being things like Azure China or Azure Germany. Azure Stack is exactly the same thing. It manifests itself as yet another endpoint, just like a national cloud. All the tools were already refactored to support the National Cloud endpoints and the Azure Gov Cloud endpoints. So that means that those tools support Azure Stack today. There's no work that has to be done on the part of a tool vendor in order to support Azure Stack because the API consistency is there. So this is really talking about that problem I mentioned, right? Customers today are used to consuming the entire stack managed by the cloud provider. And the customer might manage the application, or they might outsource the application operations to somebody like ourselves, right? So Avanade and Accenture are some of the, we're one of the largest application outsourcers in the world. So we run lots of applications for people. And we depend on the cloud providers to run the infrastructure. We don't depend on our customer to run the infrastructure, right? Azure Stack is out of the box going to depend on the customer to run the infrastructure. So if you go buy an Azure Stack appliance from an OEM, that's fine. They're happy to sell it to you, right? The other OEMs are absolutely happy to shift boxes and sell you servers the same way they've been doing it for years. It's not rocket science. They love that. They especially love the fact that Azure Stack has, all kinds of hardware requirements that make some of that hardware pretty spendy. And they love to sell you a box with the concept of reliability, mirrored DRAM, and all of these other capabilities. Well, those were all really important when I ran a box in a data center with a mission-critical workload on it. But now I've got this capability at the cloud software platform layer that abstracts me from the underlying hardware. And so as a result, just like in Azure, do you know what hardware your gear runs on in Azure? Or your workload runs on in Azure or Amazon? No. Do you care? No. Right? We've all heard stories about how a guy once a month comes along and collects all the dead nodes. That's pretty close to how it happens. And so as a result, when we first started down this journey with Azure Stack, we put our heads together and said, how can we support Azure Stack without in a way that makes sense for our customers? And we discovered this sort of gap in the market, right? And for us, I'll come back to that slide. The gap in the market really was that management platform. So we have introduced a solution into the market, and it was launched at Ignite last month at the Microsoft show pretty heavily, which is an Azure Stack solution. And we've partnered with QCT as one of the hardware providers in that solution. We've also partnered with Cisco to provide us with networking gear in that solution. And that enables us to be able to provide a managed Azure Stack service to our customers, which means that now when a customer wants to buy Azure Stack, they can buy the gear from us. They can consume it on a consumption basis. We've got some finance options and all sorts of things, so they can do CapEx or OpEx. But the big thing is, what the customer experience is the same as it is in Azure. In other words, the customer's IT staff is doing the exact same thing on Azure Stack that they're doing in Azure. They get access to a subscription. They go and deploy resources. They do what they need to do. We can manage the applications on top just like we do in Azure. It's a different service, right? But primarily, we're focused around providing Azure Stack in a consistent way with a consistent level of sort of customer responsibility as what Azure has. And if I go back to this slide, what you'll see is that it's under a single contract. That's key. That means there's one throat to choke, right? If your Azure Stack environment has an issue, you don't call QCT, right, about the hardware. You don't call Microsoft about the software. You don't call, anybody except us. We have telemetry. We have information. We'll determine if there's an issue that involves hardware. If there is, we'll get a hold of QCT. We'll get the hardware replaced, or Cisco. If there's an issue with the software, we'll get a hold of Microsoft, and we'll get the software taken care of. Remember that slide that said we have Azure capability, right? A lot of our Azure capability is backing this. What that means is that a lot of the time when you call me, the issue might not be Azure Stack itself. It might be an improper use of resources or APIs. You may be expecting it to do something in a different way than it does because you don't necessarily have that level of expertise with Azure. We do. And we'll be more than happy to explain that, that this is actually a by design thing and this is how it does it in Azure. And we'll be more than happy to spend the time to show you how to do it the way that it needs to be done in order to take advantage of the resources, right? So prior to doing the Azure Stack thing, my group spent 2 years as sort of the Azure experts inside of Avanade and Accenture. So we were if you had an Azure issue and you dialed 911 on a project, we were the group that answered. We still do that. But we're also taking that Azure experience and lending it to our customers that buy Azure Stack. So when you buy Azure Stack, one of the things you get from us is a 2-week consulting gig that's included in the deal. And most of the other OEMs, by the way, are throwing in some consulting to sort of teach you how to use Azure Stack. But what we're doing is we're actually teaching you how to use Azure and Azure Stack together in a hybrid way. So we're really going to focus around, hey, how does Azure Stack connect to Azure? How do VNets work? How do network security groups work? Because remember, we're doing the managed service, so we don't have to teach you how to run Azure Stack, because that's our job. So we can spend that time teaching you how to use it, right? And that's a key differentiator. So we talked a little bit about what kind of what we do. This is a summary of it. But the other thing that I was talking about earlier is the hardware redundancy. The fact is that Azure Stack, because it's a cloud platform and it's based on the Azure, on in essence the Azure fabric, is designed to use commodity hardware. If you guys think that Azure goes off and buys the most expensive hardware in the world to run their cloud, you're wrong. You know whose hardware they use to run their cloud? Well, you're sitting in their building, right? So as a result, we took the same track. Instead of building and using these massive boxes with all of this redundancy, we use the stuff that Quanta makes. And for us and for our customers, that means a lower cost of the hardware. And in general, what that means is that we're able to offer our complete managed service option for about the same price as everybody else is selling an option with no managed service. And that's with 4 years of managed service. So, it's a pretty, we've done that by doing a couple of things, right? We've optimized the run. If we're going to manage a whole bunch of these, it makes total sense for us to spend to make the same investment that Microsoft makes when they run Azure in terms of scripting it and everything else, right? And we have a fair amount of experience in that. We've optimized the run, which has brought the cost down, and then we've used optimized hardware. Our management host, so as part of Azure Stack, one of the machines is dedicated to being what they call a hardware lifecycle host. Our management host is by far the smallest, lowest spec management host of any of the OEMs. Why? Because we're not interested in selling you a box, right? We don't make money off of shipping hardware. That's just not our business model, right? We're passing the hardware costs, through. Where we make our money is the managed service, right? And we believe that the best way to do that is to shift as much of the cost from the actual physical hardware over to the services that we can provide. That way we can provide a differentiated service. So that's really, kind of the two keys to our offering, right? So the managed service aspect and then the lower cost of the hardware so that we can justify the managed service as a part of the overall deal. And then we've got partnerships because we're an SI with every software company, every hosting provider, right? I mean, so we can, the other, I guess the third leg of the tripod is what we always do, which is we'll stitch together a solution however you need it, right? And that includes Azure Stack as a component of the solution. I mean, we got a deal right now where we got Azure Stack running right next to OpenStack. We got TensorFlow running over on OpenStack and machines running on Azure Stack calling it. So, and that's just the power of the larger systems integrator, right? We've got that ability to reach out and partner with the folks in the company that know TensorFlow and the folks in the company that know whatever the other cloud platforms are, and come up with the best solution for the customer. So that's it. So questions? All right. 27 minutes.